So welcome to the 12th annual Quentin Skinner lecture. In 2009, thanks to the generosity of Quentin Skinner, whom we're very pleased to have with us today, the Faculty of History received funding from the International Bullseye Prize Foundation to establish an annual lecture in modern intellectual history since circa 1500. The Bullseye-Skinner scholar held a visiting fellowship at CRASSH for one term during the academic year. They presented the Bullseye-Skinner lecture and participated in the related symposium during the academic year of attendance. Now, since 2016, this fellowship has been known as the Quentin Skinner Lectureship in Intellectual History, also since 1500. Like the Bullseye-Skinner Fellow, the Quentin Skinner lecturer delivers a lecture and organises and participates in the related symposium. Past occupants of this position have been Emma Hunter, Avi Lifshitz, Sophie Smith, Teresa Bejam, Anna Becker, Karuna Mantana, Gabrielle Paquette, Tim Stanton, Joel Isaac, Hannah Dawson, and Isaac Nakamowski. Well, this year's lecturer is Katrina Forrester. Katrina is the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of the Social Sciences in the Department of Government and the Committee of Social Studies at Harvard University. Well, it's actually a particular pleasure for me to introduce Katrina, since she was, at one time, a colleague in London, and her departure to the US was mourned and still is. Katrina's academic work focuses on 20th and 21st century social and political theory and its history. Her research spans the history of liberalism and the left in post-war America and Britain, including interests in Marxism, feminism, and psychoanalysis, as well as climate politics and theories of work and capitalism. Katrina's first book was the stunningly impressive In the Shadow of Justice, Post-War Liberalism and the Remaking of Political Philosophy, which appeared with, I see it's in the front row here, which is good to see, which appeared with Princeton University Press in 2019. Here, Katrina broke new ground in the study of recently passed political philosophy. Above all, the book offered a searching, revisionist contextualization of John Rawls. It inaugurated the ambition to historicize Rawls's work. It also boldly challenged its efficacy or applicability as a viable form of politics, with reference to his own time and, of course, therefore to ours. A theory of justice, Katrina effectively implies, became an anachronism in its own epoch. Her achievement secured her the Merle-Curti Award as well as the Spitz Prize. Katrina is currently working on the category of dependency, drawing on feminist, Marxist, and psychoanalytic theories of the family to develop an account of dependency without domination, which is also, over the past years, turned her attention to questions around feminism and work. This is to result in a book about revolutionary feminist struggles in and against the state in the context of de-industrialization. Her lecture today offers a distillation of that project. So I invite Professor Forrester to address us this morning on the topic of in and against the state, revolutionary feminism during de-industrialization. Please.
Thank you, Richard, for that very generous introduction. And thank you all for being here, particularly on such a beautiful day. It is a great pleasure to be the Quentin Skinner Lecturer this year. And I'd like to start off by thanking all the people who made this possible, particularly Richard Burke, Mira Siegelberg, and Nikki Dowdowski, and to everyone here at CRASSH. I am especially grateful to the dream team of speakers and chairs who are taking part in today's symposium, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. It's wonderful for me also to be back in Cambridge after nearly 10 years away to try out arguments from my current project. This is a project that really began the year I left Cambridge for Queen Mary in 2014, where I taught for the first time classes on feminism and state theory. And I'm very pleased to see University of London colleagues here today, particularly Richard, and not least of all, Professor Quentin Skinner. It's a particular honour to be giving the lecture endowed in his name. Quentin's importance for the field and the practice of the history of political thought cannot be overstated. He is, after all, its condition of possibility. But more self-indulgently, nor can his importance for my own thought. I took Quentin's Hobbes special subject here at Cambridge in 2006. As someone who then had a kind of eco-anarchist view of the state, his staging of an encounter with Hobbes's theory of the state for me was world transforming. And it led me to think about the state and resistance to it in entirely different ways. For anyone who has been taught by Quentin, and I count in that group not only his students and colleagues, but every historian of political thought, you will know that once he has invited you to see the world through the lens he gives you, it can't be unseen. And though today I will be talking about a very different theory of the state, I can say that my interest in it and in the history of political thought in general began with him. Quentin has also long practiced feminism. He advocated for women in academia before it was fashionable to do so, and I have been a beneficiary of that too. So I'm grateful to be giving this lecture that was named in honour of his generosity to early career historians of political thought. So thank you, Quentin, and thank you to all of you for coming. Okay, with that, I will begin. Feminism has no theory of the state. Or so the feminist legal theorist Catherine McKinnon claimed in 1983 when she introduced her account of the state and its laws as enforcing men's world. I want to start this lecture by suggesting that this claim was not quite true. During the 1970s, when McKinnon was developing her path-breaking theory, a different account of the state was being articulated in the writings and practices of feminist movements. In the many histories of those movements, the state is a shadowy presence. As this Cambridge audience knows well, thanks to Quentin Skinner's field-defining work, the concept of the state can be hard to pin down. But the problem for feminists has not so much been one of conceptual difficulty, but of practical ambivalence. Can feminists use the state, given that the state has been made by men? That's the way that radical feminists have posed the problem of the feminist relationship to the state, and the answer, at least in principle, has usually been a resounding no. Why? Because, so the argument runs, the state is a form of social patriarchy or an instrument of social control that enforces women's subordination. Let me briefly canvass some influential arguments like these that were made during and since the 1970s and that underpin radical and socialist feminist critiques of the state, critiques which mostly turn not on the origins or nature of the state, but on its functions. The welfare state, Eileen Boris wrote in 1983, is state patriarchy triumphant. For Christine Delphi, a decade earlier, the state guarantees women's exploitation through the unique labour contract of marriage. For Elizabeth Wilson, it maintains male dominance through ideologies of family, motherhood, and welfare. The state facilitates the privatised violence of the patriarchal family. It fails to protect women from what Sheila Rowbotham called intimate oppression, and Shatima Threadcraft more recently has characterised as intimate injustice. It also underwrites heteronormativity and enforces racial and gender hierarchies. For many black and abolitionist feminists, these hierarchies and the state's carcerality are not only maintained through its repressive apparatuses, so by police and others who act under cover of the state's claim to a monopoly of violence, but they also work through the systems of social democracy itself, welfare, social work, and education. Thus, Beth Ritchie, writing of the US welfare state, argues it is better described as a malfare state. Now, for Marxist feminists, who are my main subject today, these institutions are also part of the way that the state secures the reproduction of labour power. For Mary McIntosh in 1978, the state organises the household and women's labour market position to provide the social conditions of capital accumulation, thus maintaining women's oppression through non-interference as much as control. The state, that is crucial to stabilising both capitalism and hierarchies of social difference. Through its historically assumed social obligations, it structures the gender division of labour and has long ensured the work of maintaining social relations falls predominantly to women, and to some women more than others. All that is to say, by way of beginning this lecture, that feminist perspectives on the state during, before and since 1983 have been overwhelmingly critical. In practice, however, the relationship of feminist struggles to the state has been more complicated than this critical theory might suggest. As generations of feminist historians have shown, Labour, egalitarian and liberal feminists advocated using state institutions to improve the lives of women and other minoritized groups, with mixed results. But radical and revolutionary feminists have also tried to use state power. Infamously in the US, this was true of McKinnon in her anti-pornography campaigning, and others who have earned the label of governance or pastoral feminism. It was also true of feminist socialists in Europe. Indeed, the historical record of feminism, and I would also wager the history of post-war radicalism in Europe and the US, is filled with critics of the state who conceive of it as variously the patriarchal, capitalist, imperialist, or white supremacist state, nonetheless using or making claims on that state. Are these instances of hypocrisy? Is this the story of radical feminists choosing what Wendy Brown once called the man in the state over the men in the bedroom? Is it revolutionary melancholia, reformist compromise, or a tragic story of how radical critiques get co-opted and social movements are defeated in the face of capital's omnipotence and the intransigence of patriarchal domination? Perhaps. However, what I want to argue in this lecture is that within the feminist tradition there are resources for thinking through precisely these questions. We can find them in the history of revolutionary feminism, in the period once known as the Second Wave, which I think can usefully be characterised as the long 1970s, from about 1968 to 1986. Now, by revolutionary feminism, I do not mean the branch of British trans-exclusionary radical feminism that claimed that label in the 70s and 80s. Rather, I mean to refer to a tradition of anti-capitalist feminism that aimed at radical social transformation, which includes various traditions of Marxist, socialist and radical feminisms, as well as the anti-colonial, black and liberation feminisms that Brenna Banda and Rafif Ziada characterised by that name. My subject today is a particular strand of this tradition, British, mostly metropolitan, Marxist and socialist feminism in and around the women's liberation movement in the era of deindustrialization, an era when women's work was being transformed with the reorganisation of social reproduction, informality in the service sector, when more women than ever worked within the state, and when the state shaped and structured life in ways that mediated the production of gender and gendered forms of work. These feminists took a critical orientation to the state as they sought to transform the social conditions of work and life, and they developed a significant body of writing about strategy. I will suggest that we characterise these revolutionary feminist struggles as struggles that operated in and against the state. My aim is to make the case for thinking about feminist ambivalence about the state as disclosing a logic of political action, one that tells us much about revolutionary social movements and their possibilities in the late 20th century. Once we see this logic, we can recognise it as having an internal coherence, and indeed I will argue that we can use this in and against the state logic as a lens for making sense of revolutionary feminism in the long-set 1970s. We can use it to reveal the different ways in which feminists operated on the terrain of the state, and to explore how feminist movements resisted and were incorporated within the state. I'm borrowing the phrase in and against the state from an important collectively authored text of British Marxism by that name, published in 1979 by the London-Edinburgh Weekend Return Group of the Conference of Socialist Economists, one of, I think, the most conceptually innovative organisations in the history of 20th century Anglophone Marxism. I'll come back to this text, but what I want to flag here is a contradiction that the authors see the state as producing, and I'll quote them. Resources we need involve us in relations we don't. That is, we, and here they mean the people, the working class, women, we need resources, but extracting those resources from the state implicates us in state relations, and in the capitalist social relations the state maintains, and the hierarchies it produces and reproduces in doing so. It is this insight, this way of thinking about resources and relations of the state that I will try to show provides us with a lens for making sense of feminist struggles on the terrain of the state. For what I will argue is this: however critical of the state feminism has been, the question was never whether feminist movements would relate to the capitalist state. The question was how. This how question animates the revolutionary feminist theory of the state, and in their debates about strategy and about practices of dissent, feminists oriented themselves to state resources and relations in different ways. Some tried to extract resources and refuse relations, others to disrupt or subvert or remold these relations, but all of them in so doing found themselves operating in and against the state. Not incidentally, or so I will argue, this logic of political action emerges as part of a politics of deindustrialization at a moment of state crisis before the consolidation of neoliberalism. So in what remains of this lecture today, I will proceed as follows. First, I want to make the case for reading revolutionary feminism as articulating a political theory of deindustrialization. And then I'll touch down briefly on three moments in the wider story. First, I'll show how the in and against the state lens illuminates the demand for wages for housework. Then I'll look to the development of the in and against the state tactic by the London-Edinburgh Weekend Return Group. And finally, I'll turn to the Greater London Council of the 1980s, when many revolutionary feminists began to see acting in and against the state not just as a lens or a tactic, but as a socialist strategy. And in so doing, I'm going to try to paint a picture of how feminist struggles during deindustrialization were waged on the terrain of the state, how militant movements ran up against the problem of state power, and how new kinds of state theories and tactics of resistance were born as a result. Okay, so let me begin first with what I see as not only a crucial context of, but as a condition for revolutionary feminism, and that's deindustrialization. So deindustrialization, understood as the declining share of industrial employment in relation to total employment, began in Britain across industry in the 50s, in manufacturing in the 60s, and accelerated rapidly under Thatcher and onwards. As historians like Jim Tomlinson have recently argued, joining Marxist theorists of the long downturn, the paradigm of deindustrialization is more illuminating than a narrative of decline for making sense of post-war Britain. And I would add that it illuminates more about radical political thought and the critique of capitalism in the long 1970s too. This is a period in which we see the proliferation of Marxist, anti-colonial and feminist theories of the state, capital and the class structure, and a widespread return to a concern with the choice between revolution and reform, much of which turned on a rethinking of tactics of resistance in deindustrializing economies. Now, although feminists did not yet always use the term deindustrialization, they did discuss the processes we now group under that label: decline in industrial output and employment, but also declines in productivity, job relocation, automation, and crucially, the shift from manufacturing to services and what that meant for so-called women's work. Their articulation of an account of deindustrialization marks what I think of as a kind of underappreciated feminist event, one that has not yet been centred in the very rich historiography of British feminism, or in recent efforts to recover the domestic labour debates and dual systems debates about, respectively, the functionality of domestic labour and social difference to capital. What I want to suggest is that we can see feminists making four innovative sets of claims about deindustrialization, and I'll take these in turn. First, they showed how deindustrialization was reorganising reproductive work as the labour share of the service sector increased, and how it was also gendering work through processes of de-skilling and reskilling, automation, and so-called feminisation. As the Wages for Housework campaign wrote, we now find the home in the hospital and the waged housework of the private and social service sector in the work of the waitress, the secretary, and the nurse. Marxist feminists more broadly began to argue that the work performed in wage service sector work involved the same labour processes as unwaged reproductive labour. What therefore had to be analysed was the capitalist and gendered organisation of work, particularly the dividing mechanism of the wage. The second related contribution was in feminist accounts of unemployment and the spatial reorganisation of working and so-called surplus populations. Marxist feminists theorised wagelessness and what the late Maria Means called housewifeisation. They asked whether women as a class could be understood as a reserve army of labour. Could the reserve army of labour concept function, moreover, as a kind of imaginative device to unite the married woman, the sex worker and the secretary in the deindustrialising North, with the racialised migrant worker who owed their position to histories of colonialism, enslavement and indentured labour, with, in turn, the semi-proletarian women workers of the global South? Drawing these connections through asking questions like these was a way of attending to the reorganisation of proletarian capital relations and of provincialising the Euro-American industrial male working class. To adapt the late Bruno Latour, feminists essentially announced that we had never been industrial. They presciently argued that the global south was not on a linear development path. Rather, informality in the south and women's situation in the north modelled what was to come for all workers, as capital pursued spatial fixes that restructured work on local and global scales. Okay, third, feminists attended to the gendered features of changing labour management relations. Now, this was particularly true of a group I have come to think of as labour process feminists, in the Conference of Socialist Economists for Subordination of Women Workshop and other interstitial centres for feminist theory. In their treatments of waged work, the site of the household often remained pivotal, exerting what Gabriel Wynant, writing of a slightly different context, has called a taxonomical force. The household was, if not the primary site of patriarchal domination, then its exemplar. In identifying what Sylvia Walby called patriarchy at work, they described how personal domination supplements or structures the impersonal domination of capitalist labour markets and the division of labour through workplace control. Others looked to shifts in the social division of labour and to the subordination creating aspects of waged work, arguing that gender itself was produced in offices as much as factories and kitchens. Fourth, and this is my last point about this, feminists explored how deindustrialization reshaped politics. As Joshua Clover has argued, the urban replaced the factory as the primary site of agitation in these years, and feminists pointed to the politics of social reproduction in spaces like the council estate and the nursery. For example, the autonomous group Big Flame, invoking a social factory account of capitalist society, agitated around consumption politics and through nursing and tenant strikes. All this is to say that feminists did not abandon workplace politics, but expanded their accounts of where the workplaces are and where class politics might be found. They also debated organising strategies. Was the choice between organising around incomes, time and flexibility on the one hand, and money and collective bargaining on the other hand, a gendered one? And I should add that discussion of these questions included important contributions from Professor Anne Phillips, who I'm delighted is with us today. In searching for new mass demands, they sometimes ceded to the depoliticization of the realm of production, but they also advocated for structural transformation far more than current critiques of post-industrial politics might suggest. In these ways, feminists were at the forefront of a new politics of deindustrialization, for better and perhaps for worse. Okay, where is the state in all of this? In each of these four dimensions, the analysis of reproductive and servicing labour, of surplus populations, of patriarchy at work, and of transformed spaces and politics of dissent, the state plays an organising role. It regulated and produced unemployment and employment. It provided or denied access to social services, healthcare and housing, making access conditional, for instance, on citizenship or on particular configurations of intimate relations. It provided some resources to women through, for instance, family allowances. It also maintained gender hierarchies by entrenching the family with aggregation laws or by engineering what Nona Glaser called work transfers, shifting responsibilities back onto the family in periods of economic crisis. The state, that is, was everywhere in women's lives. It structured their relations and constrained their resources. And as such, we find feminist struggles at many of these structuring points. Struggles for financial independence, for instance, for family allowances. And in the publications of a range of militant and scholarly groups, including Big Flame, CSE I've already mentioned, but also Feminist Review, Black Dwarf, The Race Today Collective, Red Rag, among others, here we also start to find feminist contributions to state theory. Despite disagreement, we see a consensus emerging, I think, that women's subordination is secured not only through direct social control, but by various forms of structural organisation and disorganisation. Now, this revolutionary feminist literature made many contributions to state theory, but here I want to flag three. The first was that many feminists took on the Marxist view of the state as a social relation. They meant by this both that it expresses or derives from the capital relation, and that it structures everyday social relations, including patriarchal ones. The second contribution was their interpretation of the state apparatus. Many put pressure on the argument that was then becoming conventional that divides the functions of the state into ideology and violence, and its institutions into ideological and repressive state apparatuses. They argued that each apparatus was a site of both violence and ideology. They also foregrounded the role of the state in organising and maintaining the silent compulsions of capitalist labour markets and in reproducing the conditions of capitalist social relations, including gender hierarchies. So this organising power, again, was crucial to the feminist critique of the capitalist state. The third contribution was their claim that the state is a workplace, and a workplace for women. That women could be agents of class and male domination was not news either to black feminist critics of the repressive functions of social workers, nor feminist Marxists who saw state power as synonymous with class power. But it did present a concern for those worried about what kinds of resistance and what kinds of solidarity were possible between state workers and their so-called clients in the context of the fact that, as the London-Edinburgh Return Group put it, handling the institutions of the state had become women's work. Okay, so here we have the contours of a feminist account of the capitalist state. So, what I'm suggesting here is that feminism did have a theory of the state. And it is here that we start to see the emergence of a way of thinking about resistance to that state that turns on the resources-relations dichotomy and the in and against the state logic that I laid out in my introduction. For it was clear to many that the social relation of the state involved relations that any anti-capitalist feminist would want to reject. But there was also a consensus that access to state resources controlled by that apparatus was crucial to meeting people's needs. The puzzle was whether it was possible to extract resources without becoming implicated in state relations. And this generated a range of further questions. What did this conception of resources entail? What of the idea of the state as a relation? Was it possible to subvert those relations or wield them? What would that look like? Would subversion always ultimately lead to incorporation? It's these questions that I think stand behind much of the revolutionary feminist theorising about strategy and tactics in the long 1970s. And in what follows, I want to touch down on three moments in this history. And though I'm focusing here on this resources-relations dichotomy, my broader claim is that the accounts of deindustrialization and the state I've been discussing so far are articulated here too, often in the very same texts. So let me turn now to a network of feminists who were explicitly against any incorporation into state relations, yet made a resource demand central to their organising, the now very famous Wages for Housework campaign of the 1970s. So the early 70s was a moment when revolutionary militancy and the critique of the capitalist state was in general at something of a peak. The rise of police powers over migrants, unions and strikers, alongside repression in Northern Ireland, produced what many saw as an authoritarian turn in the British state, consolidating its status as the political arm of capital, and in the words of Darcus Howe, a racist colonial formation. This was also a moment when the feminist tactic of demand-making was widely used by socialist feminists. Most famously, the four demands that the women's liberation movement used as a site of movement building, but also in campaigns like the Working Women's Charter campaign. And more generally, the 1970s saw a range of tactical innovations by women workers and feminists, as George Stevenson has discussed in his marvellous book on class and the women's liberation movement. Now, in this context, in 1972, the Marxist feminist Selma James, soon to be involved in Howe's revamped Race Today collective and the International Feminist Collective, from which was born the Wages for Housework movement, James put forward a list of demands as part of her critique of feminist efforts to work alongside the unions. Her list included the Wages for Housework demand, which would soon become the organising perspective for James's Power Women Collective. Along with other interpreters of Wages for Housework, from Kathy Weeks to Sophie Lewis to Elizabeth Stoney, I have written elsewhere about what this demand was intended to do and about what demand-making can do in general outside of collective bargaining practices. The Wages for Housework demand in particular had a denaturalising function that was meant to disclose the work women did and a constituency-creating function that hailed unwaged women as workers. But the key point I want to make here is that the demand operated on the terrain of the state and involved a theory of the state. Wages for housework saw the state as the political form of capital, where capital, as James wrote, is not, quote, a series of things which we struggle to plan, control, or manage, but a social relation which we struggle to destroy. Synthesizing the Italian workers' view of the capitalist state with the critique of bureaucratic institutions found in the work of the Johnson-Forrest tendency, of which James had been a member, the Wages for Housework also saw the state apparatuses as maintaining the capital relation and, through its power of organisation and division, squeezing out alternative forms of life. This organisation of social life made women into wageless dependents, secured their subordination, and underwrote what Wages for Housework called the patriarchy of the wage, which was the form patriarchy took, they thought, under capitalism. Thus, the state enforced the family and heteronormative sexuality and underwrote the fragmentation and control of women's time, sexuality, and labour. And yet, James and the Power of Women Collective were clear that state resources must be extracted to meet the needs of the working class, a category for them that made central the unwaged class of women workers. So they saw campaigns to, for example, extend the family allowance or claim guaranteed incomes as revealing what Susie Fleming described as the state's reluctance to pay for the huge quantity of hidden maintenance and reproductive work that women do. For it was women, not the state, who were paying the costs of social reproduction on their analysis. The demand for a wage was thus a demand both for back pay and a way of accessing the resources that would shift these costs. It signalled the refusal of women to be, quote, shock absorbers for capitalism. Now, what kind of claim about resources was the wage demand? It was sometimes figured as resources in kind, community-controlled, state-funded childcare, laundrettes, and other features of a social wage. But Wages for Housework also rejected the socialisation of housework, since it seemed to require state organisation. The demand for money was instead key. It was part of the autonomous Marxist framework of claiming more time, less work to facilitate struggle. Moreover, under capitalism, after all, money was the universal equivalent and all women workers needed it, whether the low-paid or unpaid housewives of deindustrializing Britain or the wageless migrants from imperial peripheries. Yet access to money was also figured here as a way of reclaiming the totality of women's lives, their time, their labour, their sexuality, from its organisation by capital and by the state. And crucially, for the argument I want to make here, accessing money meant accessing state resources while refusing state relations. Now, the autonomous refusal of work has been much studied, but what did the refusal of state relations entail? This is where I think the in and against the state lens is illuminating. Many revolutionary feminists of the late 60s and 70s tried to throw off state relations entirely, particularly in social reproduction struggles. Think perhaps most famously in the US context of the Black Panther Party or the Jane Collective. However, at the same time, much militancy depended on state resources. So in Britain, consider the dole, squatting legislation, the council estate. Moreover, many movements actually assumed the state should have obligations for maintaining social reproduction, as their resource demands reveal. Indeed, as Salah Mohandesi and Emma Titleman have written, revolutionary movements often incorporated the welfare state's precepts, even as they tried to subvert them. The Wages for Housework demand did this in a particular way. The very tactic of demand making implicated the state as an audience, even if the primary audience was the potential constituency of unwaged women workers. Moreover, despite refusing state relations, the demand that work done for capital and for patriarchy be recognised as being owed a wage signalled a claim for recognition alongside refusal. And recognition depended on a framework of social obligations and contracts underwritten by the state. So in this way, feminists who were struggling on the terrain that the welfare state had created tried to exact state resources, but in so doing became implicated in state relations. They were impossible to escape entirely. Now, Wages for Housework never explicitly confronted this dilemma. But by the end of the 70s, a number of critics of the capitalist state became preoccupied with this problem of whether incorporation within state relations, particularly via recognition through state categories, was a necessary consequence of accessing resources. So let me turn now to the second moment in this story, where the in and against the state tactic is introduced in the London Edinburgh Weekend Return Group pamphlet, published in 1979 and then 1980, but now widely available thanks to an excellent new edition brought out by Seth Wheeler and Polity in 2021. Co-authored by John Holloway, Cynthia Coburn, Donald Mackenzie and several others, the In and Against the State pamphlet addressed how those already implicated in state relations might disrupt or configure them by developing oppositional strategies. Now, before I get to those strategies, I want to flag what the pamphlet did in terms of its state theory. The pamphlet began from a critique of two socialist accounts of the state. First, the view of the state as an instrument, often associated with Ralph Miliband, where state control was a step towards socialism. They saw this view as leaving socialists unable to deal with class neglect and abandonment by the state, and it led to an unhealthy nostalgia for Keynesianism. Second, the view of everyday struggles within the state as peripheral to so-called real struggles against capital. This left socialists with what they thought was the dead-end view that any focus whatsoever on the state was a strategic error. The group replaced this with an account of the capitalist state as a social relation and a class practice that exceeded the state apparatus and, quote, permeated and deformed everyday relationships. Now, this analysis straddled a little uncomfortably the German state derivation theory view of the state as the political form of the capital relation, which Holloway was instrumental in introducing to British Marxism, alongside a Marxist feminist account of the state, associated in particular with the work of Cynthia Coburn. Her account of the local state in Lambeth had drawn from the Greek Marxist Nico Palatzis' account of the state's organising and disorganising functions, and she had fused this with feminist insights about how state categories maintain patriarchal rule, and had pointed to the importance of class struggle at what she called the point of collective reproduction, including among state workers. So the London-Edinburgh Return Group combined these concerns. They developed a critique of the state apparatus's dividing power. It created divisions among workers and among women, defining them with categories which obfuscated capital-proletarian relations, so categories like, for example, tenants, parents, ratepayers. State power here was, quote, a process which projects certain forms of organisation upon our everyday activity, forms of organisation that do not pose any threat to the reproduction of capitalist social relations. And here they drew from feminist and gay struggles to overthrow definitions, positioning themselves in what has since become an influential feminist epistemological tradition which looks to construct new realities through definitions. They made clear that such state definitions were not just about ideology in the sense of ideas. This was about social processes of address manifested in organisation. The organisation of the state apparatus itself was fragmented in such a way as to fragment the needs of the class. So state power here constituted a protective seal, as they put it, over capitalist class relations. So what did this all mean in practice? It meant that the state bureaucracies, often staffed by women, made it extremely difficult for working class people to access the resources they needed from the state without becoming implicated in state hierarchies which consolidated state relations. People need goods from the state, but often receive those goods in ways that, quote, reduce the control we have over our lives. So to restate what I quoted at the start of this lecture, resources we need involve us in relations we don't. Acquiring resources might entail compromising over relations. They gave here a range of examples: when leftists fight elections, say, or educational workers who, in trying to help working class children, ascend career ladders, or squatters who end up accepting licenses from the state to occupy short-life housing. Some of those examples have aged better than others. But those actors would always run up against the impossibility of reform. The relations of the state could only truly be changed if capitalist social relations were themselves overcome, yet the state apparatus as a whole could not be wielded to that end. So, short of revolution, what was to be done? It's at this point that they defined the tactic of working in and against the state. The problem of working in and against the state, they wrote, is precisely the problem of turning our routine contact with the state apparatus against the form of social relations which the apparatus is trying to impose on our action. So let me restate that. Turning our contact with the state apparatus against the relations it's trying to impose on us. Now, what's clear here is that the state is not neutral. It expresses and is trying to impose capital relations through its organisation. But there is a gap between the actions of the apparatus and the relations it's meant to express. Quote again. It cannot be assumed that the form of state workers' activity is inevitably and completely determined by the state apparatus. So here we see a departure from the analysis of state organisation that we find in Wages for Housework, and from contemporaneous critiques in Black British feminism, for instance, that analysed what Beverly Bryan, Stella Dadsey and Suzanne Scaff in 1985 would call the uncaring arm of the state. These critiques drew a tight connection between white imperial class power and state power. They pointed to the racist, repressive mechanisms in the ideological and welfare apparatuses, in the violence of child foster services, for example, or, as Amina Mama described, in the collaboration of hospitals with police after the 1981 uprisings. The London-Edinburgh Return Group certainly would agree with this account of the repressive force of the welfare state, but where they found a modicum of hope was in their claims that the power of the capitalist state did not flow smoothly through the state workers themselves. For, they wrote, everywhere cracks constantly appear in the relation between the state apparatus and the state as a form of capitalist social relations. There were opportunities in how state workers interrupt the processes of state activity. For teaching wasn't always schooling kids for capitalism. Social workers were not always acting as soft cops. A social system based on social antagonism could never be stable. All social institutions were riven with conflict, disruption, and impermanence. Okay, so what does this mean for resistance? In a pragmatic reflection on the class character of revolutionary feminism and socialism in these years, they were mostly concerned with what actions were open to state workers, professionals in education, healthcare, social care, universities, and so on, many of whom were women and some of whom at least were feminists. Many, if not all, of these workers could take the usual forms of labour action, as you all know: strikes, withdrawals, absenteeism, and sabotage. However, the group worried that, unlike action in private industrial workplaces, dissent in the social service sector could disrupt the flow of resources in the working class more than it disrupted capital accumulation. So they advocated alternative dissenting practices. What they did was look to practices that would disrupt or sabotage social relations, without harming those who depended on state resources. So their examples were work-ins by nurses to prevent hospital closures. These tactics have been borrowed by work-ins by factory workers, preventing factory closures. And also bus drivers, for example, who could refuse fares rather than refusing work, thus producing mass fare evasion and systemic disruption and extracting state resources for the class. They were also interested in what I am calling bureaucratic sabotage, the interruption of state categorization as a way of building solidarity across categories, for instance, among state workers joining tenants in protests over housing. The idea here was to bring the totality into view, challenging state hierarchies and providing new forms of counter-organisation among state workers and their so-called clients. Against the new neoliberal politics, the key was to defend and redirect resources in a way that undermined state-capital relations and strengthened alternatives. So this form of disruption to state relations while reducing for harm to workers, was framed as a particularly feminist mode of building counterpower. It wasn't uncontested. Angela Weir and Elizabeth Wilson would argue that tactics that focused on public sector non-industrial work were inadequate as a feminist response to de-industrialization and essentialized women's dissent as non-confrontational. Even so, what these tactics also disclosed was what the logic of in and against the state could mean if one conceived of the state not as an instrument to be wielded, but as a social relation. Seizing the state apparatus was not a real possibility, so disruption of the relations at the cracks was the path forward. Okay, the last moment in my story, we see in and against the state becoming not just a lens or a tactic, but a socialist strategy for superseding capitalism. This is the experiment that was the GLC of the early 1980s under Ken Livingstone. Now, the GLC is now well known as an experimental space of municipal socialism that drew ideologically from Benism, metropolitan Eurocommunism, libertarian socialism, and many other left factions, but it was also an experiment in what Irene Bruegel called municipal feminism, and B. Campbell characterized as town hall feminism. Many revolutionary feminists, most famously Sheila Rowbotham and Hilary Wainwright, entered local government, serving on the committees that together sought to restructure capital, investment and the provision of services in London. Two feminist sites here were particularly important. First, the Committee for Industry and Employment, which made significant efforts to restructure social reproduction in London, taking domestic work and childcare as part of the GLC's industrial strategy. Second, the Women's Committee, which by 1986 funded 12% of all childcare facilities in London. In 1982, the Women's Committee had a staff of 4 and a budget of £300,000. By its abolition, the staff was 100 and its annual budget was 16 million. The GLC Manifesto of 1981 had made explicit its response to deindustrialization, focusing on the decline of manufacturing and closure of the docks, and envisaging a new working class that included women and racialized minorities. This vision of a new class politics extended beyond the GLC to other councils and tried to extend beyond London in efforts to build municipal socialist feminism as a trans-regional project. For instance, the metropolitan support of National Women Against Pit Closures, though, as Florence Sutcliffe-Braithwaite and Natalie Tomlinson have shown, this had little lasting success as a socialist feminist project. Nonetheless, in the 1982 Programme of Action for Women in London, we find a municipal socialist feminist response to deindustrialization. A vision for the reorganisation of the financialising city, which involved efforts to construct counter-hegemonic spaces through networks of women's centres, and the much mocked but actually quite innovative women's bus that visited council estates as a kind of organising. So Stephen Brooke has described these spaces as social democratic zones to rival Thatcherite free enterprise zones, thanks to the surplus born from the failure of the Fair's Fair initiative on which the GLC had campaigned. But they might also be thought of as the spaces of deindustrialising social reproduction struggles, when forms of what Emmy O'Brien has called insurgent social reproduction were incorporated within the local state. Now let's return here to the question of resources and relations, and what this meant in the brief moment of what Melinda Cooper has called fiscal abundance, when the local state was at war with the national one. The GLC ensured resources flowed out of the state through housing, social care, sick pay, maternity leaves for state workers, in campaigns for unwaged women to claim unemployment benefits. The most significant resource transfer for feminists was through grant aid, which were particularly popular among those who wanted resources but refused relations. So take Selma James again. She condemned the Camden Women's Committee as a femocracy of careerists and railed against its chair, Kate Allen, following the English collective of prostitutes' occupation of the Camden Church, which I should add involved Andaye, who Imogong Moran will be speaking about today. Yet James also relied on council funding, both to support the ECP and to keep rents down on her social centre, which was directly supported by Ken Livingstone. Grant aid also implicated feminists in state relations in other ways. For though grants were direct, they were also insecure and required annual applications, which led groups to restructure their priorities such that winning resources represented a loss of control. Indeed, to some, grant aid marked the birth of a new kind of governance feminism. However, the most significant municipal socialist feminist efforts at transformation were in the realm of state relations, which they tried to remould, not just to interrupt, in three main ways. They tried to bring non-hierarchical organisation into the hierarchical state apparatuses, particularly through the women's committees, and their participation building open meetings, efforts which expressed both a Benite commitment to democratising the state and a feminist commitment to decentralisation and consciousness raising. They also tried to subvert the state's organisation of social reproduction, most importantly through anti-austerity childcare provision, and they tried to subvert its organisation of violence too, most famously with the ECP demanded efforts in Camden to monitor the police repression of sex workers. Okay, so what does all this tell us about the feminist theory of the state? The Corman era revival of interest in the GLC, which has understated its feminism, has tended to collapse together the in and against the state tactic of the London-Edinburgh Weekend Return Group and the socialist strategy of the GLC, in large part thanks to John MacDonald's recollection of the influence of the pamphlet on GLC strategy. But the GLC, and the women's community in particular, articulated a very different theory of the capitalist state. The Women's Committee was a kind of tactic for subverting capital accumulation through feminist redistribution, as well as some restructuring. Its protagonists combined a kind of Miliband Benite commitment to wielding and democratising the capitalist state with a set of Poulantsian arguments about the non-homology of class and state power, very different to the vision of Holloway and others. For instance, for Hilary Wainwright, the local state was potentially an empowering state, the GLC versus Britain PLC, as she put it. Here, feminists in and against the state strategy aim to shift political relations in the state apparatus and to use state power to change relations of production and reproduction. It expressed a view that Bob Jessup later characterised as follows, quote, "State power is capitalist to the extent it creates, maintains and restores conditions required for capital accumulation, and non-capitalist to the extent those conditions are not realised." I think this is a good approximation for the GLC feminist view. The state, as Robotham put it, was stripy, part good, part bad. Parts of the apparatus could be reorganised and its relations transformed. Thus, in this optimism, we also find here a feminist embrace of at least partial incorporation within the state. Was it worth it? Thatcher's abolition of the GLC meant there wasn't time to find out. Okay, so here are my 3 moments in this history of revolutionary feminism. Wages for housework, who demanded state resources and refused state relations, while becoming implicated on the terrain of the state nonetheless. The London-Edinburgh Weekend Return Group with their account of relation disrupting and interrupting tactics, and the GLC who elevated the in and against the state logic into a socialist feminist strategy for social transformation. To return to where I began in my last minutes, what does all this mean for the theory of the state and the history of political thought? My first concluding point is that when we write the history of radical thought in this period, we can do so by attending to strategy and to cite some forms of struggle. In this project, this is taken from my larger book project, the range of tactics I am focusing on, demand making, bureaucratic sabotage, and the women's committees, but also the strike and squatting, are among, I think, some of the best places to look for revolutionary feminist critiques of capitalism and patriarchy. But I've also suggested today that they are where we should look for the feminist theory of de-industrialization and the state. To make sense of these theories, we need to contextualize them not only in social processes of de-industrialization, but in everyday struggles around and beyond the wage. Most feminist demands were not mass demands. The WLM was never a mass social movement. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't take seriously the counter-hegemonic nature of their claims, and the fact that they spoke in a language of class politics and were in actual as well as imaginative contact with organised labour and other forms of worker struggles. Indeed, they were involved in defying women's subordination in ways that implicated a range of struggles, over exploitation of wages, over expropriation, inflation, rent, and wagelessness, and of course, over social reproduction. Okay, so my second claim that I want to leave you with is my suggestion that we reread this body of thought as disclosing an account of how to act within and against the capitalist state. While revolutionary feminists looked for new political levers, they confronted how the state mediated their actions. Their reflections thus in turn provide clues about how the state reorganises waged work and societal reproduction as well as social reproduction, broadly understood at this turning point, when the neoliberal state began to succeed from and restructure its social obligations. In this context, struggling in and against the state was a way for feminists not just to defend the social services that had nonetheless always been partial sites of domination, but to forge a response that could remake the world on feminist lines by extracting resources while refusing and hopefully transforming relations. So my third point is this. McKinnon may have been right that there was no theory of the patriarchal state quite like hers, but we certainly find feminist theories of the capitalist state. We find an account of how that state, as part of its efforts to secure the conditions for capital accumulation, maintains social difference and women's subordination, albeit unevenly, through forms of organisation and disorganisation as much as social control and interference, in ways that reveal the porousness of the state's repressive, ideological and market-maintaining functions. We also find, more prosaically, an account of the state as a set of social relations that are hard to break free from. All this sets the terms for their reflections on resistance, reflections which, like recent revisions to civil disobedience theory, swap a concern with obligation and sovereignty for strategies and tactics. They invite us to see action in and against the state not just in terms of disobedience, but of the refusal, subversion, disruption, and consolidation and reconfiguration of state relations. Okay, final thoughts. What are the implications for us today? Does the in and against the state logic provide a lens for understanding how struggles over resources implicate resource recipients in state relations today? At a time when feminists have won some battles, I suppose, but many of even the most moderate labour demands of the long 1970s seem truly radical. What it might mean, and whether it is possible to extract state relations without becoming implicated in extract state resources without becoming implicated in state relations, important difference, remains an open question. But I think it is one we need to ask. What I have suggested here is that this feminist tradition should be understood not only as a revolutionary one that recognised the necessity of superseding capitalism and of transforming even the most intimate social relations. It should also be understood as one that dwelled ambivalently in a particular contradiction. Revolutionary feminists recognised both the impossibility of mere reform and the urgent need for short-term change. And because these feminists grew accustomed to inhabiting this contradiction, here we find a treasure trove, not only of self-conscious utopianism, as has been widely appreciated, but of feminist realism, about what it means as feminists to resist, to act within, and to act against the state.